How's it going?
Great. How are you?
Good. Thriving in Japan. It's a topic that's been on our heart for a long time. What we've been wanting to do is get this discussion going amongst expats, particularly missionaries, people who have come to Japan feeling like they've got a call from God, sensing that call, coming to Japan, and then like hitting a brick wall, having hard times, having valleys and mountains and brick walls. And we've heard over the years just so many different stories of how people have just struggled. And you hear those in these little conversations at different gatherings and things, but we'd like to, through On Fire, through the media channel, and we usually, most of our media, almost everything, 80%, 90% maybe is in Japanese, but we know we have a lot of people in Japan, a lot of English speakers, foreign missionaries as well in Japan who are logging on and seeing On Fire stuff. And so for our English listeners, we've really felt like we should do this thriving in Japan topic, not just surviving, not just getting by, but really living in the promises of God. So what's your heart behind this time of creating this content? What do you feel like we're doing this for?
Yeah, I think when people hear, that leading from God to come to Japan as a missionary, and then they come here, I think that sometimes they can be surprised by some of the realities that they face. And so how to stick that out, because you know that you're called, but then there's these challenges that you face and you don't want to plateau into the just surviving by the skin of your teeth kind of mentality. And yeah, honestly, people see you and see like this pretty ganky guy, and you've been here such a long time. And so I think everyone, especially people that have only been here for a couple of years or whatever, they want to, that's their goal, is to be ganky, and full of joy and passion that doesn't wane through the years that go by. So, yeah.
And it's a long-term conversation, eh? Because, I mean, you've been here now, tell us, how long? 3 years? 2 years?
2 years this time and 9 months before that.
That's right. And probably you're a very social person. You like getting out and meeting people and connecting with Japanese Christians, pre-believers as well, and lots of foreigners. And you're picking up a vibe, a feel from people. So what would you say, what's the barometer? What's going on in the missionary community that excites you, makes you feel hopeful, and also what's like a concern? Is that a bit of a too broad of a question?
Pretty broad. I mean, I think people are in that same boat, just wanting to live out a life that has a lot of joy and living out of that abundance, because there's a lot of thirstiness that you see in Japan. Like people are hungry and things. And so especially when you're a Christian, you want to be showing people that you're drinking from this fountain of Jesus, right. That you have something. But when you start to look like everyone else in the subway, like so tired and so burdened by whatever, then it's like, well, oh my goodness, there's something going on here, because I can't show Jesus to people if I feel that same weariness that you see on the trains.
Sure.
So I think many people feel that way.
Yeah. I think it's also universal. It's not just Japan.
No.
I think part of what we want to do here as well is just bring a really honest, real discussion. I want to make it really practical. I don't want to get into like comparisons and things like, oh, I have to compare myself to other people, because actually I think that's the disease of this age, because of the blessing of the internet. We're now got these super connected platforms, and there's lots of good stuff about that, but the flip side, the negative side of being connected so much is that we get to compare so much, and sometimes that's just really superficial. So the comparison is Instagram comparison or Facebook post comparison, or even prayer letter comparison. It's like people are writing prayer letters, and you're going to write probably for your prayer partners. You're going to write really positive
You
stuff.
focus on the highlights on all of these platforms, right?
Exactly. So, and now we're a media saturated lifestyles. Every day, maybe we're taking in that information. And so I think what we'd like to do with this discussion is really kind of step back from that, take time, do it a little bit slower. It's funny because, this is probably like the first time we've actually sat down and recorded a longer discussion, but we've had hundreds of discussions, right?
Yes, likely.
One of those, I mean, I've been enjoying that. My wife is actually, of course, been a part of most of those discussions as well, but it's just been life-giving, would you say? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So much. I really love when the three of us sit down and just like talk about really fun things and crazy things and challenging things. But it's been such a blessing actually for me.
Yeah. And us too, of course. And I think sometimes we've had these discussions and like thought, oh man, we should have recorded that.
Yeah.
Because it's
midway
not
through.
It's not like what we have is like extra special or anything. I think it's like what I see in the Word and what I've felt over the years. I guess it's kind of in an extreme form in Japan because maybe the culture is sort of like a perfectionist culture. So if you're in when I say traditional, I'm not saying theologically traditional, but traditional church, I mean like a legacy church means a normal sort of church where you come together once or twice a week. Oftentimes those relationships you can be really intentional and get some really good relationships, but oftentimes those relationships can be quite shallow and people want to show their best face. And of course the Japanese culture is a perfectionist culture. So I mean, we just hear those stories all the time, maybe pastors' kids or missionaries' kids, because they're brought up in that culture and they come with such a as they come through their teen years and their 20s, they come with such a performance mindset. Like I've got to be the good missionary kid. I got to be the good pastor's kid, and maybe that's extreme, but that's a little bit. Well, that's quite common for the missionary experience. Do you think so? To have a relationship where we've been able to be really honest and talk about stuff, and
it's so important though, because if you only have a front that you show people of all together, that's not sustainable long term though. And I think that's really what people who are starting out as missionaries in Japan, they really want to be long term.
Yeah.
They want to know how to sustain that, and so you need to have relationships where you can just talk openly. And it's vital, I think. Yeah.
And you're actually brought up on the mission field.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about that.
So between age 4 and 15, I was on the mission field as a MK and in Asia. And so I really appreciated having that when I came to Japan because I'm from Canada, but I had so much of my formative years in Asia. And so I think that's been really helpful for me. I was talking the other day with a couple and I was explaining that I grew up in Asia and they're like, oh, this is a Japanese couple. And they said, oh, this is why we got like Asian vibes from you. And that made me really happy because it's invisible, but it's there.
But you do, I think you pick up on, and getting to know you, it's been like you've picked up a lot of sensitivities and most of that, I hope it's a good thing. Sometimes you obviously just have to be aware of that, but sensitivities to the missionary community, right? So you were in a missionary community, probably even more so in Central Asia where you were, because
Southeast Asia,
because of the gap, what do you say, the poverty gap, where a lot of people are living, quite difficult lives. In Japan, people are not so, there's not so many people living financially difficult lives. It's more on the emotional level. So like as an example, what would the sort of normal challenges be over in when you were growing up where your parents were?
That's also a really broad question.
Yeah, it's a really broad. But were the physical challenges bigger, or the logistical challenges of living in a nation like that, or was it relational challenges or the spiritual? What comes to mind?
For sure, spiritual. Especially when you're in a country where there's very like idol worship and stuff is happening in your face, and you really can feel that, and you can feel it, but you can also see it at the same time. So yeah. And yeah, it's a really big question, but
yeah, I mean, that's some of the stuff that we want to get into in the next coming weeks.
Yeah, I do think it's really different in Japan. There's so many differences, though.
Right. Well,
because oftentimes when you go into a country that's a little bit like South Asia, for example, yeah, you're coming from a developed country into a developing country. And so that's a big difference in Japan, where we're coming from developed countries into developed.
And do you think that, like, coming to Japan, a lot of people are looking at logistically and lifestyle wise, it's like such an easy move. It's so logistically easy. I'll find an apartment, pay your money, beautiful. You've probably got more luxuries here in Japan than we do back home in my hometown, New
Except
Zealand.
for central heating.
Yeah, that's true.
No central heating in Japan.
So people maybe come in with a little bit of a, this is not going to be that difficult.
I really think that's so true. People think that it's going to be similar to how their life was in the West because it's a developed country. And so there's so many shocking differences that face you right away. And you're like, oh, wow. Because it's a developed country in Asia.
Right.
Yeah.
So what do you think about the statement that you hear, the graveyard of missionaries? I've actually heard that statement regarding multiple cultures, not just Japan, but it is said of Japan, it's the graveyard of missionaries. Have you had any thoughts about that?
Yeah, like just in what we said before about sustaining things so that you don't perish on the field, because coming from my perspective as someone who's kind of starting out, I just don't want to be that statistic, because you hear that all the time. And so I think other people that are also starting out, like tomorrow I'm speaking to someone who really wants to come to Japan as a missionary. And so there's a lot of people and no one wants to be that terrible statistic. So what can we do to change the kind of the trend that was before,
right,
and make a change from that?
So specifically speaking, though, I think, one culture that I heard was being spoken of as the graveyard to missionaries was actually northern India, and was a physical graveyard for missionaries, because they would actually often get killed.
Wow.
On the mission field. A lot of persecution by militants of various backgrounds.
Yeah.
So there was actually a literal graveyard for missionaries. In Japan, specifically speaking, what does that mean? Do you? I know statistically, maybe you can update me on if you have other information, but was it 3 out of 5 missionaries leave after the first term in Japan, or is it 4 out of 5 or something like that?
Or they leave before they planned to. So if they plan to do 3 years, they will leave at 2, or they leave at the first term without renewing.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or they just start surviving,
Sure.
which is a form of death in a way.
Yeah. No, totally.
Yeah. Like plateau.
Right. And again, just to reiterate, this discussion is not in any way an accusation against people who have left Japan or are struggling. Of course, this is the opposite. We really want to actually provide a conversation and a safe place to talk about these things. We hope that it'd be really good. I mean, just before we started, you looked at and you found a Facebook post of a missionary friend who's obviously had some big struggles and been bold and putting some statements and vulnerable statements up online, which is really good on that person for doing that.
Yeah.
The safe place question mark is a huge word now in the secular culture as well. Of course, it's taken too far, and it basically means a free for all, like don't judge anyone for anything ever type of craziness. But there is truth to it. And that's what we really want to provide here, as a safe, vulnerable place, because I want to be vulnerable. I think you do too, and we want to, in these coming months and years, talk to people, get conversations going, and talk about what life has been like in Japan, what struggles people have gone through, but what victories they've had. Because we don't just want to sit in weakness; we want to find strength. We want to find what happened here. Why did this person have the struggle, and how did they break through? Because I think one of the biggest things about sort of like the isolationism of the culture is that people do feel alone. They feel like, oh, this is only me.
Yeah.
And of course it's not. You know, so many people are thinking and feeling the same things. And not just Japan. I mean, any country.
I was going to say, like, the isolation thing, people feel that all over because of social media, because you're scrolling and you're seeing people together or whatever, and it just makes you feel like you're isolated.
Right.
So it's kind of this new thing that we're dealing with this age of social media as well, worldwide. But
absolutely. So it's a great time to have that discussion and talk about it, and we'll just throw out that invitation while we're at it for people to contact with questions. And if you have a story and you'd like to even share it, just contact, and maybe we can set up an interview time and things like that, because there is so much. I mean, one of my favorite verses in Ephesians 3, I think, it talks about the inheritance of the saints, and it's just this amazing, abundant sort of phrase that talks about the power of God. What does it talk about? I mean, three different things, but one of them is like the power of God, and one of them is the inheritance in the saints. And I think a lot of us are still yet to experience that depth of abundance of what it means to be a brother and a sister in Christ. And part of that is the freedom to be vulnerable in a place where people are really going to not accuse, but there's going to be forgiveness. There's going to be building up one another to, of course, repentance and recovery and deliverance and freedom if that's needed. But it's like this ongoing commitment for like growth into eternity, because that's where we're going. You know, we're going to this place of where it's going to be all about our relationship with God and one another. And we get to practice that a bit now, and that's the inheritance of the saints, I believe. So, do you have any questions?
Yeah, because I was going to say, like, there's, you know, this graveyard for missionary thing. There's all of these different challenges that people face, and then for some people, the challenges get so much, you know, and so but there's a bunch of challenges that we got some people to share as well, and came up with a list, and of things that people deal with when they come here, and wanted to know about ways to thrive through that, like to push through that and come into that place where with Jesus, like, you can actually thrive even in the face of difficult stuff, like the isolation and the loneliness is a really big thing. I think, Japan is kind of known as being a struggle in this area.
Well, maybe I could just like share a few thoughts from my background coming.
Please do.
Before I came to Japan, and I was just looking here.
How long have you been here now?
I've been here 27 years, coming up 28 next in spring.
So how old were you when you moved to Japan?
I came to Japan on a YWAM, Youth of the Mission team, in the year 1990. It was way back in the day. And that was a interesting... that's just a long story in itself, but I actually never left New Zealand, and I was part of my YWAM Youth of the Mission DTS. They have a 2-month outreach after that, and I was part of a tour that promoted missions. Did I ever tell you the story?
I don't think you did. Tell me.
It's like it was a really bizarre situation, because normally a YWAM DTS is set. You go with your DTS fellow students, right? Well, on my DTS, I just did not feel there was about 30 or 40 people, and a bunch were going to India and a bunch were going to go to Australia, I think it was. And I just didn't feel either. And right on the deadline, when we're like literally a couple of weeks away from going on outreach, through the base that we were in New Zealand, this drama team came through. Like, they were doing drama, and they were planning to go on a tour of the South Island of New Zealand promoting missions. And they had organized like 50 different mission groups to come along, or to at least to send their information with them. This was YWAM's way of serving other mission groups. And they had accumulated all the literature and stuff, and they would go and visit for 2 months a tour around the South Island of New Zealand, dozens of locations, and promote just this heart for the Great Commission.
Cool.
And so super, super cool. And they were visiting through our YWAM base, and they needed actors for their drama team. And we were in an open meeting, and the leader of this outreach was sharing that, we need actors. So if anyone here on the base is, feels called, please come. And I was like, inside of me, like, yes, oh man, that's something I would like to do, because when I was young, I loved acting and loved just, being on stage. I know it's hard to imagine. But the interesting thing was I'd so like to do that, but I think it's impossible. But my DTS leader actually came to me and said, Jef, would you be interested in going with them?
Cool.
And I was like, yes. So I basically jumped out of my DTS a week early, I think. And I went around the South Island of New Zealand for 2 months promoting missions. I'd never been on missions myself, but I was making friends with missionaries who had been out. Some of them had been out. I mean, one woman, for example, she was older, in her 60s, 70s, had come back from Africa. She had amazing miracle stories from like 40 years ago, where she had, for example, spoken in tongues and preached in tongues once in the local dialect without even knowing a single word, So she had cool experiences, and there was all these different mission groups, very traditional ones as well as some radical ones. And it was a great experience, and I made some of my best friends. Even currently, I have one of my best friends is still from that time. And it was interesting. So, okay, long story, but basically the drama that they created, it was just a little 10, 15 minute drama to talk about how God would talk to a young man and show him to go overseas and partake in a short-term mission trip.
So cool.
And get a heart for missions for that nation that he visited.
Wow.
And end up going there and living there for life.
Wow.
Well, I get that role.
Wow.
I'm the one who got that role, right? I'm the one who ends up, and I talked to the authors during when we're actually preparing and practicing the drama. I talked to the authors, and they actually said, and we had Japan in mind.
Whoa.
So I didn't have Japan on my radar at that time. I was like, maybe, I was surrounded by a lot of missionary type people. So I had missions in mind on a personal level, but I didn't have necessarily like, I'm going to go to Japan. But during that trip, I met a friend, Roger, still one of my best friends, and he was I was 20 and he was 22. Looking back, it's like, man, in the day when you're 20, 22-year-olds look big. It's like, whoa, he's 22. Yeah. Roger had already lived in Asia for 4 years since he was 18, And he had been in Hong Kong taking these teams out around Asia. I think they're called FEET teams, Far East Evangelism teams. And he'd been taking them out and, just exposing people to missions and the need. And a lot of people would get a heart for missions through those experiences. And he wanted to come back to New Zealand and do the same thing. So he was starting harvest teams from New Zealand. And again, we just prayed and felt like I wanted to join him and help with that. And I was actually, because I had done a DTS, I was on staff with Roger and 2 others, and then we had 6 others, 10 in total, join us. And from March 1990, we departed, and the first country we came to was Japan. And basically what had happened in that drama happened with me.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's really cool.
So I came to Japan at that time, just for those 4 weeks. We went on, we visited a bunch of other nations. But then, always just asking God, looking for a way to come back to Japan full time to live. Learned Japanese as much as I could in the meantime.
By only speaking Japanese even to your foreign friends?
Well, not at that time. I mean, my Japanese was very, very limited at that time. But I was pretty crazy. I was living in Auckland in New Zealand, which is the main city that most tourists arrive in when they visit New Zealand. And so there was a fair amount of Japanese tourists, and I would accost them at local tourist spots and start talking to them in Japanese. And some of them were quite amiable and like, oh, that's nice, someone's trying their Japanese. And then others were kind of like, oh, put out. I didn't come here to practice my Japanese.
That's funny.
But something had happened in me about coming to Japan, and so I sought that route to come back. So fast forward a little bit there's so many fun stories in between. Then I went to a worship school, learning about worship, which looking back, was a huge key for me personally. But I think one significant thing, and I'm just looking for the Bible verse here, if I can find it, is before I did actually move to Japan in 1992, I felt this scripture from Isaiah 58, and I'll just read it. If you keep your feet from breaking the Sabbath and from doing as you please on my holy day, if you call the Sabbath a delight and the Lord's holy day honorable, and if you honor it by not going your own way and not doing as you please or speaking idle words, then you will find your joy in the Lord, and I will cause you to rise on the heights of the land and to feast on the inheritance of your father Jacob. The mouth of the Lord has spoken. So this is funny because, I received that word way back in 1992 when I was just preparing to move to Japan, and it's like, oh yeah, good, the Sabbath, the rest in the Lord, it's good. But really over the last 28 years, that has been such a key in my life. And that's probably going to be the drum that I'll beat more than anything else, is this: what is the Sabbath in the Lord? And how are we delighting in that? How are we delighting of course, it's not a day of the week. It's a place of rest in Him. And you see this, the promise here is just so clear. If you delight in the Sabbath, if you delight in the Lord, you will find your joy in Him. And then God will cause you to ride on the heights of the land and to feast on the inheritance of your father Jacob.
Wow.
Yeah.
And I just feel like, especially another thing in Japan is work orientation. There's so in that kind of a context, walking this out is interesting.
Yeah. I'm glad that, again, I look back and I think nothing's by chance. God, for example, I mentioned I went to this worship school, and I guess part of it is like, I want to learn how to lead worship for a group. I want to, be more effective as a worship leader. That's a good thing. But if I look back on it, it was actually more just nurturing such a heart of worship. What does it mean to be a child of God? What does it mean to love God and to remain in His love and to stay in that place of the Sabbath rest? In fact, I actually have a verse from this morning for that. If I can share that as well, that would be...
Please do.
Interesting. Psalm 39, verse 7. It's one of these psalms that's kind of quite tough. It starts off, when I was silent and still not even saying anything, my anguish increased. It was one of these psalms. And then right in the middle there in verse 7 it says, but now, Lord, what do I look for? My hope is in you. And interestingly, the Japanese of this is, where is it? Verse 7, yeah. それはあなたです。私の望み、それはあなたです. It actually doesn't say my hope is in you. It says my hope is you. And it was funny because this morning I was just over here and reading this and worshiping and praying, and the cat came in, as he does, and he doesn't particularly like me. He's okay when he wants food. But this morning I gave him his food and he didn't eat it. And instead of eating it, he was kind of a little restless, walking around a bit. And I thought, maybe he wants to sit on the couch. So I sat on the couch. He came over and he sat next to me and he just started purring and let me pat him for a bit, which is kind of weird for him, but it's like God spoke through that. It's like this subtle difference, but it's actually huge. It's like, is my hope in God, or is my hope God himself? Am I looking, in one sense you could say, am I looking to God's hand, or am I looking to his face? Because we all have needs, and we should be looking to God's hand for that need. Our hope is in him. Our sustenance, our needs, our financial needs, our guidance needs. Okay, that's all good stuff.
Our emotional needs.
Our emotional needs.
Yeah.
God, it's in you. Okay, but this verse is saying, my hope is you. It's the person. It's your face.
Wow.
It's your presence that gives me joy, that gives me sustenance. That's why worship is not like, oh, well, for some people that's a gift and others it's not. It's, yeah, okay, surely for music, the musical side of it, yeah, but that's not what worship mainly is. It's that expression of communion with God where you are dwelling and lingering. I like that word, lingering with him in that place of focused attention. Yeah.
That's so good. Practically in this really busy context that we live in, and especially when you have a lot of, ideas, ministry ideas and stuff, and kind of go. Like, how do you practically live out that lingering aspect? And especially when you're doing mission work. And so sometimes people said that, like, when they open their Bible, they're thinking about, how they can share this with people. And then they realize that they haven't been going for themselves. And
Yeah. Really good questions. How do you practically do it? Everyone is different. Everyone's lifestyle is different. But like anything, if you value something, you will prioritize it. Yeah. I've heard a phrase which I don't keep I don't keep perfectly myself. That which is prioritized is scheduled. I think it is. Maybe I've misquoted it, but it's something like that.
Over there.
Yeah, it was on my computer. If you really prioritize something, you will schedule it, and it doesn't mean you're dehumanizing it. It's like, for example, as a couple,
or making it religious. You're not doing that either.
Exactly. Yeah. If you're a couple and you're having a hard time finding time together, it would only be logical to schedule time together. Hey, honey, in the next week, where can we find time? My wife and I, we're fairly okay with that. We find time. We both value that time, so we find time without scheduling it necessarily. But if you really value something, you have to schedule it. If your schedule is getting fuller and fuller of stuff, just like activity, even good stuff, and that's the hard thing, right?
Even important, yeah.
You have to be even more diligent in scheduling that time. Now, for some people, that ends up sounding religious or legalistic or what, but I've never ever seen it, never in my life, as religious or legalistic. My sons do. My teenage sons are kind of like, oh, Dad, you're just religious. But I never seen it like that. I see it as life.
Yeah.
So, okay, practically speaking, my weekdays are fairly loose, and I work more on the weekends, and sometimes I leave home quite early, 8 a.m. in the weekends. I know that's not super. Some people out there, they're like leaving at 7 a.m. or earlier.
Yeah.
So they have to work that out. But okay, for me personally, a weekday is an easy day to schedule time. However, the weekends, I just have to get up that little bit earlier, and I just have to make it that much more of a priority. And there's so many logistical and even physiological things that play into this. Like, if you look at people who are emotionally strong, generally have really set schedules. Yeah. So they wake up at the same time each day. They generally just have the same pattern each day. That sounds terribly boring to a teenager. It sounds, hard for a person who's not like that, but it actually has huge benefits. So from a young age, I planned time with the Lord regularly every day. And that would be on different seasons. Sometimes it was at the night. When I was single, it was often at night. For some reason, I'm trying to remember, but I think just before I got married, I think it might have been, I felt a challenge from God to just give 2 hours, 6 till 8 a.m. to the Lord every day. And I know that for some people that freaks them out. Okay. I'm not putting that on anyone, but that's something that I've always aimed for.
There's something about the morning and like the first fruits, people say too.
Yeah.
It's significant and sets your day almost.
That's right. Yeah. I have come from I guess people would say I'm a highly disciplined, self-disciplined person. That is, again, if you're not like that, I don't want to take that. I want that to be like a condemnation on people. But I think everyone can. I'm always looking to improve. I'm always looking. I mean, just recently I've been doing a certain amount of time in my physical workout every day, and recently I just increased it by 20%. I'm like, I need to increase. I need to keep on pushing the envelope. I'm getting older. And part of that, the early morning routine has just been just so precious to me. And I oftentimes, if I miss it because of something, that's fine. I'm not legalistic. I don't get down on myself. It's actually the opposite. Sometimes I'm just itching to get out there, At the moment in winter, it's hard, but I still value that. That's a whole topic in itself. I mean, what routine have you found that works for you?
Well, I just want to back up one thing because you said something that I wanted to speak on as well. But this year I really learned, because I'm a kid that grew up in the Christian church, whatever. And so I had all these different ideas about especially time with God. And so I went through a time earlier this year where I was really, really busy especially for 5 weeks. I was speaking a lot. And my mentality was, okay, I'm not religious. And so God knows that I'm really, really busy right now. And so I was just kind of running on fumes in terms of intimacy with God. But I was thinking, he understands, Yeah. But then what I realized later was how much I needed him. And it wasn't about something I have to do because of my religion or anything like that. But I desperately needed the time with him. And I learned a lesson the hard way. Like, next time I'm going to ensure that I have that time with him, especially during the busy times. I need him even more, Yeah. So that kind of flipped that on its head. One other thing I learned this year, because Japan, for me, when I moved here, it did feel isolating. I did experience that. But really amazing thing that I feel like I learned was throughout my life, like good Christian people, like friends, they always were there for me. And I didn't really learn how to go directly to Jesus. But something about this period of time where all I had was him, it shifted it in my heart where he is my number one now. The first one I go to rather than other people. And then the community that he blesses people with is like a blessing, a second thing. But that relationship with him is number one. And so, yeah, so grateful for that. So I've been figuring out, we had a bit of a schedule change this year, so I'm still figuring out what 2020 looks like in terms of making sure that I have that with God, not for religion, but for, like, I want to be with him.
That's right.
That's how we can have a deeper relationship. You can't expect to have intimacy with Jesus without spending time just like a married couple. They need time together. And so
totally good.
Yeah. And I love the mornings. There's so many verses about starting your mornings on his promises. And so for me, mornings are important.
This is such a huge topic.
But even bookending, right?
Yeah.
At the end of the day as well.
End of the day. It's good. Such a great topic. I think we just need to keep on talking. We're going to be hitting on this drum again and again. The Sabbath, rest is one of my favorite topics. I'm not a Sabbatarian. I don't believe necessarily in one day of the week. some people do, and great. And I just like Paul's words in, I think it's Romans 14, where he says, some treat every day the same, others treat one day special. That's great if you do that. There's a lot of flexibility in that. But when I'm talking about the Sabbath, the time that we spend just devoting to the Lord is so important. And maybe today's talk, we'll wrap it up about here with an encouragement, just to say, encourage people to just take stock of your priorities. Yeah, take stock of when you had that passion. Maybe it's like in Revelation, is it chapter 2, where the Spirit of Jesus is talking to the churches and says, go back to the first love. And that's encouragement, but it's actually really quite a strong rebuke to those of us who have got busy at times and we've forgotten why we're doing what we're doing. We've forgotten why we came to Japan. Why did we, pay all those sacrifices, make all those sacrifices, give up all those things to come here? That was for him, for his presence, for his joy, for communion with him. And so, let's keep this conversation going. We're going to look more practically at how that can happen for some people where as we're carrying on.
A lot of other challenges we want to talk about.
Yeah. And I just want to encourage, finally, one more time, if you have questions, thoughts, or you want to be a part of this conversation, go ahead and get in touch.
Yes.
And have a great week.
Bye-bye.